All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive, and this one is on Kr8tom, more specifically this company called SheLeaf. And you've sent over a bunch of articles and like some website info, so we're going to dig into all that. But what I found really interesting about SheLeaf is they're like laser focused on women and women's wellness. And they even say that they tailor their Kr8tom blends specifically for women's needs.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever heard of anything like that?
I mean, it's definitely a very like niche approach. I mean,
Oh.
Kr8tom, it's been used traditionally in Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
but this is a very specific demographic they're honing in on.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe before we even get into like the specifics of what SheLeaf is claiming, maybe we should back up
Sure.
and just explain like what Kr8tom is for those who might not know.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kr8tom, it's basically, it comes from the leaves of a tree. It's a tropical tree called Mitragynine speciosa, and it's native to Southeast Asia. And people there have been using the leaves, for centuries. And it's known for like its stimulating and pain relieving effects.
Yeah.
And traditionally they would chew on the leaves or brew them into like a tea.
Okay, so, and I know I keep seeing this word, alkaloids.
Yeah.
What are alkaloids?
Yeah, alkaloids, think of them as like the active ingredients
Yeah.
in Kr8tom. So these alkaloids are what are giving Kr8tom like its unique effects.
Okay, so when SheLeaf talks about alkaloids,
Yeah.
specifically mitragynine, painanthine, and speciogenine,
Right.
what are those? Why are they so important?
Okay, so each alkaloid has like a different effect on the body. So for example, mitragynine is known for those like stimulating and pain relieving properties that we're talking about, whereas painanthine and speciogenine, those are associated with more like relaxing and mood boosting effects.
Okay, so you mentioned they have two main products, Rise and Rest.
Yes.
So what can you tell me about those?
Okay, so Rise, it's marketed as like an energy booster.
Mhm.
So it's designed to enhance focus, provide pain relief. It has a higher concentration of that mitragynine, which, like we said, is known for its stimulating properties.
So kind of like a natural alternative to coffee or energy drink.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. SheLeaf even suggests that it could be helpful for like managing fatigue.
Okay, so what about Rest then? How is that different from Rise?
So rest, like the name implies, is designed to promote relaxation, relieve muscle tension, improve sleep. It has lower levels of that mitragynine, and instead it emphasizes painanthine and speciogenine.
That's interesting how they're positioning these blends. And they seem to be very focused on like transparency and quality control too.
Absolutely. They really emphasize like their sourcing practices, their lab testing procedures, and their commitment to using like pure Kr8tom with no fillers or additives. They even have those QR codes on their packaging that link directly to the lab results.
Is that common in the Kr8tom industry?
Not necessarily. The level of transparency that SheLeaf is, promoting, that's definitely above average for this industry. It could be a response to growing consumer demand for more accountability and traceability, or maybe just a way to kind of differentiate themselves from other Kr8tom vendors.
Yeah, for sure. Either way, it's good to see a company taking those steps, I think. Now, you mentioned earlier that Kr8tom can be like a controversial topic. Why is that?
Well, there's just been a lot of debate about, Kr8tom's safety and its potential for addiction. Some people are concerned that Kr8tom could be like a gateway drug to more dangerous opioids, while others believe that it could actually be a safer alternative for pain management.
Okay, and so where does SheLeaf stand on this whole debate?
So SheLeaf, they actually address this directly on their website. They have a whole article discussing the opioid crisis and how they believe that women need those safer alternatives for pain relief. And they cite research suggesting that Kr8tom might have a lower risk of respiratory depression and addiction compared to those traditional opioid painkillers.
Now, they also talk a lot about personalized dosing. What does that even mean, and why is that important with Kr8tom?
So it's crucial because everyone reacts to Kr8tom differently. Factors like your metabolism, your body weight, your tolerance, even the specific strain of Kr8tom can influence how it affects you.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all dosage.
Exactly. SheLeaf really emphasizes this process. They call it self-titration. It basically means starting with a very low dose and then gradually increasing it until you find like that sweet spot that works best for you.
That makes sense. Seems like finding the right dosage is really key to getting the effects that you want without any unwanted consequences.
Absolutely. And SheLeaf provides a lot of guidance on their website about how to do that safely and responsibly.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. In this first part of our deep dive into SheLeaf, we've talked about what Kratom is, how it works, the different alkaloids, and their effects, and SheLeaf's kind of unique approach to targeting women's wellness. Stay tuned for part two. We're going to delve into SheLeaf's business practices, their commitment to sustainability, ethical sourcing, and we'll get a little bit more into the science behind their alkaloid-optimized blends.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into SheLeaf. And in this segment, we're going to be taking a closer look at their business practices, specifically their focus on sustainable sourcing and ethical harvesting.
I'm really curious about that. You hear so much about greenwashing these days. I'm always a little skeptical when companies make those kinds of claims. So what makes you think that SheLeaf is actually, walking the walk when it comes to sustainability?
Well, one thing I noticed right away is that they're very clear about where their Kr8tom comes from. They source from both overseas farms and some in Southern California, which is kind of unusual.
Oh, that is interesting. Do they say anything about the differences between those sources? Like, is there a quality difference between Kratom grown in, say, Southeast Asia versus California?
You know, they don't really get into specifics about that. But they do emphasize that all their Kratom, regardless of origin, undergoes rigorous testing for purity and potency.
So they're at least trying to be transparent about where their raw materials are coming from. But what about the actual harvesting process? How do we know that they're not, just stripping these trees bare?
Right. Well, they talk about practicing continuous harvesting, which means they only select mature leaves from the trees, leaving the rest to continue growing. So that helps to prevent over-harvesting and ensure the long-term health of the trees.
Makes sense.
But they do mention that their manufacturing facility is GMP certified.
Okay, so what does that mean for consumers?
GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. So essentially it means that the facility adheres to strict standards for hygiene, equipment maintenance, quality control, and documentation throughout the entire production process.
So it's kind of like a seal of approval then. That assures us that the products are being made in a safe and responsible environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about their products themselves. SheLeaf puts a lot of emphasis on this alkaloid balancing. Can you break down what that means and why it's so important?
Sure. So remember how we talked about alkaloids being the active compounds in Kratom? Well, the exact mix of these alkaloids can vary depending on the strain of Kratom, where it's grown, and how it's processed.
So it's not as simple as just saying Kratom. There's like a lot of variation within that.
Absolutely. And that's where alkaloid balancing comes in. So SheLeaf, they analyze each batch of Kratom they receive to determine its unique alkaloid profile. And then they very carefully blend different batches to create their rise and rest formulas, ensuring that each one has the desired ratio of alkaloids to produce the intended effects.
So it's almost like they're creating a recipe, carefully measuring out each ingredient to achieve a specific outcome.
That's a great analogy. And this level of precision is what really sets SheLeaf apart from a lot of other vendors. They're not just selling raw Kratom powder. They're actually using, scientific techniques to create these standardized blends that are more consistent and predictable.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into the science then. Behind their two main blends, Rise and Rest, we know that Rise is designed for energy and focus, while Rest is more for relaxation and sleep. But what are the specific alkaloids that are responsible for those different effects?
Okay, so let's start with Rise. This blend features a higher concentration of mitragynine, which we've talked about, known for its stimulating properties. It interacts with opioid receptors in the brain. But unlike traditional opioids, it doesn't seem to carry the same risk of respiratory depression.
Okay, that makes sense. So apart from pain relief, what other benefits are associated with mitragynine?
Well, it's also believed to have those stimulating effects, so it can boost energy levels, enhance focus, even improve mood.
What about their Rest blend, then? What are the key alkaloids in that one, and how do they work?
Okay, so Rest features lower levels of mitragynine, and instead it emphasizes two other alkaloids, pananthine and speciaginine. These alkaloids are thought to have more sedative and muscle-relaxing properties.
It's so interesting how they're able to create these distinct blends by manipulating the ratios of these different alkaloids.
It really speaks to their understanding of Kr8tom's complex chemistry, I think. They're taking a very scientific approach to creating products to target specific needs.
And they claim that Rest might be helpful for things like anxiety, sleep support, even migraines. Is there any research to back up those claims?
There have been some small studies that suggest that certain Kr8tom alkaloids, including painanthine and speciogeny, might have what are called anxiolytic effects, which means they could potentially help reduce anxiety.
Interesting. What about the sleep support claims? Does Kratom actually help people sleep better?
Anecdotally, many people report using Kr8tom to improve their sleep.
So far we've explored SheLeaf's business practices, their commitment to sustainability and transparency, and the science behind their alkaloid-optimized
And it's
blends.
clear that they're taking a very deliberate and thoughtful approach to Kr8tom, and they're setting a high standard for the industry, I think.
But our deep dive isn't over yet. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore SheLeaf's views on the opioid crisis, their emphasis on personalized dosing, and some final thoughts on the future of kratom and women's wellness. Welcome back to our deep dive on SheLeaf. Now, we've talked a lot about their products and their whole approach, but one thing that keeps coming up is the opioid crisis. And it seems like SheLeaf is really positioning themselves as part of the solution. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a bold statement for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
the opioid crisis is such a complex problem. There's no easy fix.
Yeah.
But SheLeaf's argument, it seems to be that women in particular need safer pain management options.
Right. Yeah.
And they think that Kratom could be part of that, especially given its potential for pain relief without those same respiratory risks as traditional opioids.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be appealing, especially for women who are struggling with chronic pain, and maybe they're wary of the addictive potential of prescription painkillers. But I know some experts have also raised concerns about kratom's own potential for dependence. So how does SheLeaf address that?
Well, they're pretty upfront about the fact that Kratom,
Yeah.
it's not a miracle cure. And they really stress that it needs to be used responsibly.
Yeah.
So they really emphasize starting with a low dose.
Yeah.
And gradually increasing it until you find what works for you. That self-titration process we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're really trying to empower people to take control of their own health and well-being. But how practical is that for the average person? Wouldn't it be easier and safer to just, follow a doctor's instructions?
Ideally, yes. But the reality is,
Yeah.
a lot of people, they just don't have access to affordable and effective pain management.
Right.
And even when they do, they might be hesitant to rely on those medications because of the risk of addiction.
Right.
Or other side effects.
So it seems like SheLeaf is tapping into a real need here. Right? I mean, they're promoting this substance that has potential benefits, but also potential risks. And they're also encouraging people to kind of experiment with their own dosage.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. And that's why they are very clear about saying, talk to your doctor. Talk to a medical professional before using Kratom, especially if you have any underlying health conditions or are taking other medications. They're not saying Kratom is a replacement for conventional medicine, but
Yeah.
it's something to explore potentially.
Yeah, and it's refreshing to see that
Yeah.
because they're not just promoting their product as some kind of cure-all.
Right.
They're acknowledging that it's a complex issue. So where does this leave us? We've explored SheLeaf's claims, their products, the potential benefits, their commitment to quality and transparency, and their stance on the opioid crisis.
And we've seen how they're trying to offer a natural alternative for women who are seeking relief from pain, anxiety, sleep problems. And they're focusing on that personalized dosing and emphasizing responsible use.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into SheLeaf Kr8tom. We hope this has been informative and thought-provoking. Remember, knowledge is power, and we encourage you to continue learning.